Today we are living in a modern society, in a modern world. But have you ever wondered where do these modern things, for example, the everyday paper that we use or the globe that we use, how were these things created and why were they created? Right? So in order to delve into that story, we need to first look at a few pictures. So here in the screen, you can see that there are several portraits, right? So, some portraits are of human beings, some of gods, and some of, possessions. For example, we can see the Garden of Earthly Delights. We can see the portrait of Mona Lisa, the creation of Adam, the process of Annunciation. Also the portraits of the ambassadors. If you look at these pictures, we see the various innovations in science that might have been taking place at a time. For example, this man here is experimenting with some kind of chemical. This is a sort of laboratory that was, used for these testing purposes. Then we come to the picture where the anatomy of human body is being studied. So for example, in this particular picture, if you take a close look at it, the person who has drawn this out has very minutely mentioned the position of a person who would have been an archer, right? So we can see the exact position of how to arch, or when in archery, how do you pose? Again, if we look at these pictures, this is the picture of a forearm. So the detailing in these pictures show us that human anatomy was being studied at some point of time. Now, this particular slides shows us the compass, the globe, the study of moon and sun, and then a series of these pictures. So we see that these things like the compass, the globe, the map is being used to search for new directions, to quest for new things. And then finally we reach upon the astronomical inventions that might have happened or might have taken place when study of stars was being taken as a very important thing. For example, here we can see people are setting their apparatus up to study the stars. Now, when we saw all of these slides, you could very well understand that these slides included, pictures from art, science, anatomy, astronomy, geography, right? But who created these things? For example, the compass, the globe that we saw. Who were the creators behind them, and what was the reason behind this creation? So if you take a look at the screen again, you will see the pictures of the pioneers of Renaissance. So these were the people who created all of these things. Now the interesting fact here is that all of these things were created in one period of time in history. And that period is known as the Renaissance, right? But why exactly this period, what happened during this period, and how do we situate this period is what we need to study about. So in order to understand this period, we need to go 1500 years back in time to a period that spanned over 1,000 years. During 500 BC, we see the start of the classical antiquity that saw the rise of one of the greatest empires of the world, which was that of the Romans. So we are stating this period as the period of classical antiquity. Now, the period of classical antiquity also saw the advent of the world religion of Christianity. Now, this was the peak period for the Roman Empire, which was highly stable. peaceful and prosperous, because at this point of time there were limited amount of wars, and the Romans had established a control over their territory. They had centralized that control. So we see that this particular period reached an amount of prosperity due to the Roman rule. So soon after, around 4th century, when the political situation started to change, because the Roman Empire now was going through a phase of constant warfare, and there had already been a split. So the Roman Empire, as we already know, was divided into the West and the East, right? The Eastern Roman Empire, that was known as the Byzantine Empire, marked in pink right here. So this period saw a constant instability, and this instability was also due to the rise of several feudatories. So several feudal lords were taking in the power, the position, right? This saw the advent of the Dark Ages that spanned from 4th to 11th century. Now this period also saw the rise of the Renaissance ideas. So around the 13th century, when we have already witnessed 3 consecutive crusades in the region where the Islamic empires are taking in the area of Byzantine Empire, and this factor is re-establishing the trading links, because after the fall of Roman Empire around 4th century, these routes, the routes for Western side of the Roman Empire had closed for their trading purposes, because the Islamic empire had already been encroaching upon this area. So as soon as the crusades took place, this route was opened up for trade again, and this very factor, which was trading, caused the decline in feudalism, because now from agriculture, from land being the primary place of occupation, the focus was shifting to trading. Thus, in 1453 AD, when Constantinople falls, we see that this phase of turmoil continues, because Europe is hit with Black Death and plague. Now, Black Death and plague were, almost very similar to the pandemic, the recent pandemic that is caused due to the COVID-19, right? People were dying, and there was a crisis that arose, right? And people, due to this crisis, after this crisis as well, they started to migrate to various areas. Now, migration was not only because of Black Death or plague, it was also because of the fall of a capital. It was also because the fall of feudalism. All right. So now when these people are migrating, they are not just migrating from one area to another, but they are also carrying their ideas from one area to another, their cultures from one area to another. Now, then these cause the exchange of ideas when they were carrying their manuscripts. When we mention manuscripts here, essentially whatever written material they had, the records that they had, they were carrying it during the migration. So if you can take a look at the picture that is situated in the background, then you will see that this horse, is reduced to a skeleton, and the people are clearly dying. So you can imagine that how the situation was when a capital was also falling, and there was a huge crisis in economy as well, and there along with it, it was a health crisis because of Black Death and plague. So after a point of time, therefore, the crisis also ended, which was around 15th century. And now when people started to migrate, they started to settle in several places. People essentially wanted to go back to the older ages, to the ages of classical antiquity, when there was, an amount of stability, an amount of peace, right? So they wanted to go back to the golden age, that is the age of antiquity. Now, due to this intermixture of cultures because of the migration, trade also was booming. As we saw that the trade routes opened up, and this ideally, because the focus was also shifting to a secondary occupation, we see that the spirit to revive the old classical ages have already, begun. Because now people could focus not only, on their primary function of livelihood, but also make an effort to, make it a better place to live in, right? Because they had just emerged from a phase of crisis. Now, we have already studied about the Middle Ages, which saw the advent of the Roman Empire and also the fall of Roman Empire, right? And this was also the age where Christianity had, taken birth and also spread. So it became a world religion as well. Now, at this point of time, when we are talking about this world religion, we have to remember that the church became the institution that institutionalized this sort of religion, which was Christianity. So, slowly and steadily, therefore, God became the center of the society. And, everything became an act to please either God or the Orthodox Church. So, the Orthodox Church, therefore, had, a say over everything in life, and in fact in afterlife as well. So from the king to the peasant, everybody was under the church and its dictates. So the church therefore is the primary institution, right, that was looking to organize the society. So everything came under the scrutiny of the church. So this was the situation during the Middle Ages, when everything was centered around God. Now slowly, when people are migrating, they are also, as we have spoken about, there is an intermixture of cultures, ideas. Now when people are intermixing, they also come across several other ideas. Slowly and steadily, with changes like the printing press. If you can see the picture here, then it is shown how books were being printed, how the Bible was being printed, right? So that revolutionized the society. And once people got hold of that, they were now, gaining the knowledge to question this, authoritative power that was the church. So now when people started to question, the focus shifted from God, or in fact we can say church, to humans. Now, humans became the center of every discussion. Okay? So, from this very fact, we come upon the idea of the humanist ideology. Humanist ideology, therefore, became the spirit of Renaissance. But what is humanist ideology? Now, in basic sense, when we talk about the humanist ideology, the idea comes from humanism. For example, you are currently studying a subject which is history, and this is also included in the umbrella of humanities, right? So, on one hand, there is the natural sciences where you study, physics, chemistry, biology, and on the other hand, under the umbrella of humanities, we have subjects like history, geography, English, and all of that. So, essentially, when we focus on what humanist ideology is, in a broader sense, we refer to a system of values and beliefs that is based on the idea that people are good. So, here people is basically humans. So, humans or people are good, and that problems can be solved using reason. So, in this very area, we see that humanism talks about rationalism as well. instead of religion. So logical thinking, rationalism is logical thinking instead of the God-centered view. So ideally we see the focus shifting to the humans. So then this, change was something that became the idea, became the spirit of this period called the Renaissance. For example, Renaissance is the period where we saw these inventions of compass, globes, these beautiful paintings, the pioneers creating their work, right? So this period ideally included all of these fresh ideas and the revival of the old classical ages as well. But what was exactly the Renaissance? Was it, a set of beliefs? Was it a set of values? Or was it a cultural movement of these changes? So if we try to look at the underlying factor here, we see that it is a belief system which includes ideology, a movement, or an event. So Renaissance therefore can be in any form, right? It can be an ideology, it can be the thoughts, it can be the ideas, it can be a movement in the change, the way the pattern of painting was changing, or it could be an event. For example, the invention of printing press, right? Ideally, therefore, the essence of Renaissance lay on the fact that individuals now were the core factor in the society. And this core factor was driven by reasoning and logic. So, rationalism. So we see that the belief system that was based on reasoning or logic, which was developing during this period, ultimately influenced art that included paintings and architecture and sculptures, and also influenced literature and science. So can you tell me what exactly was the Renaissance age? Was it a belief system? Was it a movement? Was it an ideology? Or was it all of the above? That's correct. It was all of the above. Thus, we can say that, Renaissance is not exactly something that happens and we can recognize it by that particular happening, right? So that becomes the abstract form of history. Why so? Because it is not like, we can say that, oh, let's come out, Renaissance is here, right? So, ideally, therefore, this period becomes a form which cannot be identified by a specific factor, okay? For example, if we just try to compare it with a modern day example, when Berlin Wall fell, you can see the picture here of the army, demolishing the Berlin Wall and people who were witnessing it. Right, when the Berlin Wall fell, it was a very specific event. People were there, it happened on a particular day. But Renaissance was not, a particular day or a particular happening. It happened in one stretch. So it was a period that we are talking about. So here then we come to the spirit of Renaissance, which was humanism. Now, humanism depended on reason and logic, rationalism, and human agency, where individualism becomes a very important factor. Now, Renaissance also ideally drew inspiration from the classical period, which we discussed, included Greek and Roman civilizations. So, this inspiration that Renaissance was taking from created the idea of rebirth of the old ages, right? Of the golden ages. So the Renaissance period in Europe, which was from 14th to 17th century, was the period that moved into the early modern. Not exactly like the modern world that we live in, but essentially the Renaissance ideas or ideologies was what created the base for the modern world that we live in, right? So the Renaissance period therefore saw changes in political, economic and cultural spheres. Individuals like we see Kepler, we see Da Vinci, Shakespeare, they came up with their own opinions. So here we see therefore the rise of individualism, that humans are more and more becoming the core, right? And because of this individualistic approach, we see the growth of art that was being encouraged in terms of music, literature, education. Thus, when we discuss about, people like Kepler, Da Vinci and their work, we need to realize that all these people were driven by the factor of individualism, right? So, if, there wasn't a phase when they could move out of these enclosed spaces that the church had created, the shackles that the church had created, would they ever be able to create these beautiful forms of art or the scientific logical thinking, the process of it? No, right? So what happened exactly is, in this period we see the emphasis on individual agency, or as we discussed, human agency, and this period provided freedom to individuals' spirit of experimentation. So now they were allowed to question, right? Now they were allowed to make errors as well, because experimentation and observation will include both of these. So portraits became very important testimonies of individualism. Why? Because if we, for example, consider the sculpture of Pieta by Michelangelo, we see that here, the expression of Mother Mary holding her son becomes much more clearer. So now the artists essentially were experimenting with the human emotions. They were experimenting with human expressions, right? And if we look at Mona Lisa, the famous painting of Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci, this is a very controversial portrait as well, because people have come up with the theory that Mona Lisa is smiling a little. But here we need to realize that the artist has put so much of detail in the human expression that it looks as if a lady is sitting and smiling at you. The most important example is that of Shakespeare. We are, you are at a phase where you're reading about As You Like It, or the plays by Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet. All these were, they arose from the factor of experimentation, because at that point of time when, before this phase, when everything was about God, everything was being written about God. But from there, literature shifted the focus to human expression, emotion, rather than religion. Thus, Renaissance becomes a cultural movement, because in the core of it, we see the humanistic belief, and through that, we can view the progress in art, we can view the progress in literature, science, architecture, drama and dance. And this humanistic belief was also driven from the factor of inspiration from ancestors, the classical antiquity. Now, here we discussed that people were migrating. All these people were migrating. There was an intermixing of cultures. But where were these people exactly going to? Right? They are moving from somewhere and they have to settle somewhere. So Italy became the hub of, the ideas that this period was to propagate, right? People were settling down in Italy, and we see the first sort of progress happening in this age of Renaissance right here. So as we have discussed that Renaissance, because it took inspiration from the classical antiquity, it is also called the Age of Rebirth, right? But why exactly rebirth? In a few pointers, because it tried to firstly revive the ancient spirit that was driven from the Greeks and the Romans. So it emphasized on intellectuality, individuality, and realism. So we see rationality, science, human agency, and the realistic ideals. So the humanist ideology, as we were discussing, was promoted in all of these fields: art, dance, music, drama, literature, humanities, which is education, and science as well. Now this period focused on the importance of reason and logical skills. Thus, what did it essentially do? What was its primary focus? The focus was to liberate the individuals from the shackles of the church. So in a way, this was the phase which saw the rebirth of the antiquity, coming back of the peace and stability, right? So thus they were coming out of the dark ages that had begun with the 4th century. Now there we see a reawakening of art, culture, science, technology, and music. So we also viewed the discoveries and explorations of new continents and the growth of commerce. So of course, none of these things would be possible if the trade routes weren't re-established. We also see innovations like the paper that we use today, printing, the mariner's compass, and gunpowder. So therefore we see these were the gifts that the Renaissance period gifted to the modern world that became the most essential pieces in this modern world, right? So thus all of this becomes the contributors to the modern world we live in. Thus, as we saw these inventions, these pioneers, the various movements, the growth of culture, all this happened in the period of Renaissance that ultimately, impacted the world that you and I live in today.